We're already recording, and so welcome to the Comics and Medicines Confab. I'm going to be talking about comics and style today. I'm going to try to keep it 10 minutes, but if you've ever heard me talk at any given point in my life, you know that that's going to be probably damn near impossible, but I'm going to do the best that I possibly can. I'm going to walk through so I'm going to talk about how I'm going to use some random art, and then I'm going to talk about how I dealt with content and style, specifically in writing my graphic memoir, Fights, One Boy's Triumph Over Violence. And just in general, I want to give out a trigger warning. Fights has sexual abuse, bullying, emotional abuse, violence, and a lot of those things. And so when I'm going through these images, I'll be talking about what I was trying to do when I was conveying those things. And I'm going to try to keep it to about 10 minutes. And then after the 10 minutes, 20 minutes, I don't know, something like that. And then after that, we'll open it up to questions, and you guys can put questions in the chat. I won't be monitoring the chat. Or you can just ask me questions, and I would just ask while you guys are here to make sure you keep your mic off in the process, so that we don't hear your cat purring really close to the microphone, which has happened to me already, or your kids. Actually, I was in a big group meeting for mass art, and we had our a union meeting, and somebody didn't turn their mic on, and their kid came in, and they were like, "Yeah, this stupid meeting." And they were like, "How long is the meeting, Mom?" And the mom was like, 3 hours. I really don't want to be at this dumb thing. Like over to like 200 people of mass teachers. So like, just keep your mic off. So let's get started. I'm going to share my screen, and you can put your questions in the chat. So if there's something that I say that you guys want some information about, just put the questions in the chat, and then I'll try to get to it as we wrap up. So like I said, my name is Christian Gill. I am a professor and a cartoonist. I make comics typically about Black history, but for the most part, Fights was my first thing that was not specifically Black history. But when I think about content and style, I think about specifically this quote by Mary Oliver, which is, "Emotion doesn't create style, style creates emotion." And what I took that to mean, because she was talking about how we process style style and emotion when we're dealing with writing, but I always think about it in terms of art. My MFA is in painting, so and that's where I started teaching, was in traditional studio media. And all of this, so just FYI, all of the stuff that I'm going to be talking about comes from a book called Art Fundamentals, Theory and Practice. So if you want to pick that up, if you can find a used copy of one of the older versions, those are the better versions. The newer ones are garbage, so don't get those. But any work of art has three essential opponents. They have form, they have subject, and then they have content. Form is the arrangement of elements in an art according to principles that foster unity or the total overall appearance. So when I say form, and when I've taught form, I've always taught form as like design. And so that's the first part. So subject, form, and content. Subject is the person, place, or things that we're actually depicting in a work of art. Here we have, and some of you might be familiar with these two images. These are quote unquote religious paintings. One is the Descent by, one is a Descent. They both look like Descent paintings. When I teach this in class, I typically have students ask me to answer questions about what they think these paintings are about, these images are about. And because these are people that don't really know, they're like, these are people who are super religious. This one, the one on the right-hand side is about how Jesus is the light of the world, all of these different things, right? And then I talk about content, and that's the essential meaning or significance of a work of art. Content refers to the sensory, subjective, psychological, or emotional properties a work of art contains, as opposed to its descriptive aspects alone. What that means is that we take the content of any given work of art. So when you look at these two things, these two images. The one on the left is Descent by Rembrandt, and the one on the right is Piss Christ by Adrian Serrano. And when you're looking at these without that information, they seem like something else. But because of the way they use form, because the way Adrian Serrano uses form, the materials, right? Because it's like Piss Christ is, if you're not familiar with it, Piss Christ is a crucifix stuck in a jar of urine. He shook it up, took a bunch of pictures of it, picked out a really amazing picture, and then almost got the NEA, almost got their grant funding rejected because Adrian Serrano did this. And the other one was The Descent by Rembrandt, and that was basically probably done because, you know, religious people were the ones who paid for most paintings. But in these two images, we're using form to alter the content. So we're using how we've done these things in order to make people see things. One of the complications, one of the like common conversation pieces that I get about my work is how simplistic and how all ages the style is. And so I remember when I first did Strange Fruit, I did a book signing in Cambridge at the Harvard bookstore, and a woman stood up and was like, how does it feel to be making these very serious images with this very cartoony, silly style? And I was just like, I don't even know how to answer that question because it just didn't even make any sense to me. But in the process of the way I work, I try to think about how to arrange things. So this is the beginning of Fights. In the beginning of Fights, I wanted to set up a fight that I was having in my professional life now. And we had a really bad dean at my previous institution. And I think I spent more time talking about him than I did talking with him. And every one of my conversations with him was terrible. But anyway, so I'm having this conversation with somebody on the phone. And so like I stop and I pause. So that fourth panel, I'm just sort of like stop. And in this one, I'm using pacing to show like this serious sort of, like I'm stopping in this place for a second. And so pacing is one of the things that I do, like stretching out time to show things. There's a place, I don't have a slide of this. There's a place in the book where I actually talk about time passing and how slow these things are. So pacing is one of the things to think about when you're trying to create emotion. You want to let things linger in places to let people see and feel that emotion for a minute. This is the first bully I had was a girl named Kiki, and I was about 5 or 6, and Kiki was probably just in 3rd grade. And so when I introduced Kiki, I want to make her much bigger than I am to show like how terrified I am of her. And then whenever I show her after that, she's always the biggest thing in the image. So to show like this really big image of this girl who was probably adorable when you look back on it. She was probably like this adorable little 3rd grade, eight-year-old kid. But to me, she was absolutely terrifying. And so I made her big to make sure she filled up the frame so that it's, and so every time you see her again, it's like, it's very dominant. She's a very dominant. And so two things are happening here. I'm using repetition, hierarchy of scale, and dominance. If you're not familiar with hierarchy of scale, it's a term used in art history basically to show importance by making something larger. It's typically demonstrated in like Egyptian hieroglyphics and those type of things. But here I just wanted to make sure that every time you saw Kiki in this sequence in that 1st or 2nd chapter, she was the largest thing on the screen, even though in reality, she was really small. And I use this again later on when I show that I have personally become a bully to sort of repeat that same iconography about how dominant I fill up the frame, and I fill it up in the exact same way that Kiki was filling it up for me. So that I'm like showing you, going back to this one place where I felt something and showing you how I projected those emotions onto someone else. And dominance becomes when I was writing about being like a little kid, being small in the space was something that I really wanted to spend a lot of time on and really wanted to show people, like, this is how you feel as a little kid. So there's a part in the book, when I was a kid, I used to have these recurring dreams. When you read Fights, you'll understand, like, my recurring dreams were basically just a repetition of what was happening to me during the daytime. And I would have these dreams that I was falling asleep in the back of the car. And when you're a little kid, you fall asleep in the back of the car. It's like the best thing ever. You just lay down, you go to sleep, the car rides, you just get there. And I kept having these dreams, but every time I would wake up in the dream, no one would be driving the car. So I would wake up, look over the steering wheel, and there would be no one there. And so that was a metaphor for like how disconnected my life was in general at the time. But when I showed these images, I always showed myself much smaller in the car than a kid would have actually been in the car, right? Like this kid would be like, you know, a foot high if they were actuality, but instead I made them really small. And then on my first day of school, at a new school, I wanted to also do that same thing where you show how small and insignificant you are in the way in which you look at the whole image, right? Like this little tiny person is indicative of how tiny and small I felt in relationship to the world around me. So I kept doing that to show you how lost and alone and insignificant I always felt within my surroundings. Because Fights deals with sexual abuse, this is probably one of the places where I had to really think about what it felt like, but sort of separate how I felt about those incidents versus how to actually convey those images. And so it was almost being like an out-of-body experience. I had to step away from, you know, like who I was as a person in order to think about how I use those formal elements and principles of organization, those tools of art to make you feel a certain thing. And I had lots of options for that, right? I could just be really explicit and draw those things, but I thought that was more pornographic, and not pornographic in that it was over the top sort of thing. So I really just thought about it. And there was a time when I was an undergrad when, for whatever reason, pink was like a color for sex for me. Like it was just like this thing that I always thought of when I thought of sex. I thought, like, it's funny because Kriota is pink and green right now, and I'm like looking and I'm just thinking like those are the two like sex colors that I you're like right under me in the screen, which is hilarious right now. So anyway, so I started like step back and I'm like, okay, I want to display something without actually saying what's happening, but I want people to be clear about what's happening. So in this situation, I wanted to make sure that, you know, there was this dominant shape and then a smaller shape. So hierarchy of scale, but in this place to show a power dynamic, and also not spend a lot of time with a lot of images. And so in these images, I made sure to make, anytime that there is sexual abuse happening in the book, it's always these black squares with, you know, this one pink word balloon and a white one with no tails, just because that's kind of how I thought it made sense to show how that feels, like you're just in the dark and these things are happening. And then do the same thing with the text on the same thing when I'm just like on the next panel, it's just that. And so, and this is something that gets repeated over and over and over again in the book. Whenever this happens, I wanted to set it up really early in the book so that when you saw the black panel borders and the black panel with pink in it, you would automatically know what was happening. So it was sort of a way to put the emotion in that and also teach you how to feel about that thing when you see it every time you see it. And so that's what I continue to do that over and over and over again. And these things specifically are all things that I do consistently throughout Fights. In places where I had my editor for when Andrea Colvin, who was my editor for my picture book Fast Enough, she kept telling me there were places where you need to let things happen and slow it down. And so like, that's information that people will, you know, when you put words in it, people tend to read and keep going. But if you put pictures in it, you can actually slow that space down. Like that's where people will spend the time there. And so I wanted to make sure that I was being conscious of how I was spending time, how you, the reader, was spending time in those spaces, and how I was gearing you toward that. So, like, this is really convoluted, but I'll explain it to you really carefully, just so you understand. So when I'm using the form, which I'm using composition and design, I am using these formal elements of art, right? That's line, shape, value, texture. And they are applied using the principles of organization, which is harmony and variety. And that's balance, economy, dominance, proportion, and movement. So taking all of those things in very small places and figuring out what things how they feel when you're looking at them. So line, shape, value, texture, and color, that's just drawing the pictures. But balance is when you are actually applying to a composition, like what does balance imply in that composition? How does that work? And so for me, that means balance means stability. So when the things are balanced, it means stable. So when you take a lot of stuff out and you use economy, that's what you're playing with. That's sort of like slowing things down. That's what those two the pink and the black and the sexual assault scenes are. It's about economy. I'm not giving you much information, so I'm leaving you to think about a lot of those things. Dominance was happening over and over, and proportion was happening over and over. Movement typically happens within the frame and on the page, creating space and unity. So, and that's my story. So if you all, I think I was exactly at 10 minutes. It's mostly because I spoke really, really fast. So, so now is the time to ask questions. Unless you know, Kriota, Ben, Georgia, if y'all have something you want to add to what I was saying.
I'll jump in and just say thank you. That was amazing. Oh, I see people are raising hands, so they have questions. Joel, I feel like you just packed so much information in a short period of time that there could be lots and lots of questions, or it could just be something that we all kind of, exit in a daze. But okay, so Patricia, you were just clapping. Is Alice, did you have a question?
He was clapping too. That was clapping.
It's just all clapping. Okay, great. Well, I want to say especially about your comment to do with time, how like the style of how you deal with time is going to completely manipulate the reader's experience of a moment, manipulate in the best way. I really appreciate that because for me, like one of the things about comics that is so powerful, and is particularly powerful anytime we're talking graphic medicine, any sort of medical experience, health experience, mental health experience, time is such a huge factor. And it's so different for everyone. And the gravity that we have in comics to like throw around is actually one of its greatest powers, I think.
Yeah, and I think like it's really interesting because when dealing with comics and dealing with, because you like page and transition is time, right? Like page equals time for a comic. So you are actually drawing out the individual, like you're drawing out the moment. So how do you slow that up, speed it up? Because we have so many different, Scott McCloud's like meanwhile comics that transcend space and time, but we also are dealing with truncated amount of time. So when you have like this consistent page, 1 page, 2 page, 3 page, how do you transition? How do you slow us down in one spot and speed us up in other spots? And what I did in fights was slowing us down in some places would be like one panel with not very many words on it that I would spend a lot more time drawing. And when I was trying to do something that was way more, when I was trying to speed time up to show you a lot of sense of time, I put lots of panels together so that you would go through them one after another, after another.
So while I was listening to this, a couple of things really came across my mind. One is just a story that I'd actually like to share, because I think your lesson this lesson is very
dense.
But also, I think it's fantastic. Like, I'm actually thinking of one specific student I have, or had a number of years ago, who was so enamored of comics because, like, he felt like this kind of emotional transcendence every time he read his favorite comic books. But he assumed that in order to convey or to, like, invest readers with this emotion, that he had to be feeling that ecstatic emotion while he was making the work. And he would not trust me when I said to him, no, you have to actually sit down and focus and, like, you know, like, do some drudgery, or, you know, like, be mindful of how you're working.
Yeah, you have to separate. Like, that's a thing that's, like, really difficult. You can't, like, people, I don't know, like, you don't make art, you don't make angry art when you're angry.
Right.
You don't make sad art when you're sad. You actually have to step away from it and look really objectively at that and go, okay, how do I take these things, these tools, and use them to create this feeling in someone else? And so a lot of time you actually have to think about your own personal feelings when you're reading something, and then figure out what's making you, this is that know thyself thing, right? Like, I know that I do this when I see these things, and that might be something that everybody else feels. So if I can recreate this by slowing things down, speeding things up, using something big, making something, you know, like simplistic drawing versus really complicated drawing, and how those things sort of, like, come about when you're dealing with any kind of information, that's when you're actually playing up the idea of, like, the emotion. You're creating that emotion. I remember when I was in undergrad, there was this woman named Sylvia Snowden, who's a painter, and there was a show of her works at the de Cordova in Washington, D.C. She had made all these images of her son, who was about the same age I am now. Back then, he was shot in Southeast DC. And so she did this thing where she made these images about him, and they were very abstract. It was very decorative. Like, like, when you look at it, you would think arts and crafts sort of a thing, not really painting, but they were really, really powerful. And you could see how she was manipulating, you know, like, these materials, like this really, she was using glitter and, like, really interesting things to, like, make you feel a certain way. And then when she came and gave a gallery talk, like, later that day, I was like, because I was so emotionally impacted by the images, I was surprised that she could sit there. But it really sort of gave me this real clear understanding that she'd already been through this, and this was, like, the cathartic experience for her had already happened, right? She had already dealt with it. That's why she could make the art, because she could sit down and actually make these things in a very specific way by thinking about it in a very, you know, like, I don't know, sociopathic way. She separated herself out and looked at what she could do, and then made the stuff that made me feel that way. And I think that's what you have to do.
Yeah, and you're dealing with some really heavy shit in your book, and you've really done an excellent job of conveying those types of emotions. And also, another thing about the book is that you, in addition to scale and looking at the physical relationships, physical sizes of your characters, you're also very adept with facial expression and posture. And I think the posture also is something that people don't necessarily think about, and, like, the way you've worked it into the book, I think really just kind of helps to tip us all the way over the edge, and, like, brings us even closer to the characters.
So Patricia, you have a question?
Yeah, so I was thinking again about, everyone's talking about the pacing, and you were talking about the balance of words and images with the pacing. And I'm also a sexual abuse survivor, and I wrote a poem cycle about the worst incidents of abuse that I actually remembered. I don't remember all of them. And one of the things that I did in that is, I found when I wanted people to slow down, I actually used fewer words. Now, poetry and comics aren't the same. And I found that I was kind of taking that as a parallel to some of what you were talking about with the pacing. And I find when I'm reading comics that if there's a lot of stuff on the page going on, I may turn the page slower, but I feel like things are busier. And that when there's fewer things happening and there's just a few lines and a few images, I tend to stop and settle in that moment and in that space.
Yeah, I think when I'm drawing like 2-page spreads or a full page spread, I tend to spend way more time on those pages. And because I want you to spend more time there. And so like I actually add more detail to it. If I'm drawing like, you know, it's got 3 tiers, this page has 3 tiers and 9 panels on it, I'm going to, like in those panels, I'm not going to spend as much time on those unless I want you to slow down in those places and look at stuff. So it's kind of like how you can, you know, like if it's almost like if you think about comics and if you've ever looked at someone who really, really draw, like if you look at people who are basically illustrators who start drawing comics, not people who've actually thought about how cartooning works, right? So people who are illustrators who start drawing comics will typically spend way more time on those pages than they're absolutely necessary. And so every single page becomes a page that you want to look at. And if you want to look at every single page, you're actually not reading a story. You're just looking at an art book, which can be beautiful and which can be amazing, but it doesn't do the same thing. So it's almost like you have to have this balance between how much you draw to like, so think about it in terms of like with comics and medicine, it's like, I really want you to spend time on this place where I've drawn this diagram for how you give yourself a shot, right? Like this is where I really want you to spend time on. I don't want you to spend as much time when you're like in the waiting room, in the car on the way there, when you get to the doctor, any of that other stuff. That stuff is like filler for the most part because there are places where you want to slow down, and that's where you should spend more time giving us more detail, because all the other stuff is just sort of like, it's filler. It's like information that you need, but it's not necessarily as important as this spot right here. So slow down in this term, and with pacing is like you draw out things, you make sure that there's a lot of information, you make sure there's a lot of detail, so people will spend more time looking at it.
You see, what I'm trying to say is the opposite of that. That if you're just reading a comic, you know, flipping pages, then it's, you know, the number of words on the page and you're just going through. But when I'm reading a comic now, it's the pages with the fewest things on them that stop me. Fewest words, fewest images, fewest lines, big, bold movement or graceful lines that connect things. And those are the things that slow me down when I'm reading comics now, which is kind of the opposite of what you're describing.
Yeah, that's typically not the way that I work. And I was just thinking about a really good example of this, just like it just popped into my head, is the book Beautiful Darkness. If anybody's ever read that, it's really amazing. But in the first couple of pages, it's like all these really simplistic little cartoons. And then when you finally get to the big reveal, it's really drawn. It's like a lot of detail, like lots of information and everything else, because they really want that emotional impact to just basically hit you in the face with what you're actually looking at. And so I find that it's different, that's different for me. Like, I think it's different, and I don't know how you guys feel about it, but for me, it feels like when you draw like a cityscape on a two-page spread, like you put a lot of information in there if you want people to look at it. But when you're drawing that same cityscape on a 9-panel grid, you're only going to put so much information because you're not going to spend as much time there. I don't know how you guys feel about that, but that's the way I look at it.
I feel like it comes back to another one of the concepts that you were talking about, Joel, the importance of variety, and that, I think generally speaking, I respond to things the same way you're talking about, where, the added detail is what slows me down and what captures my attention. But I'm not thinking of any good specific examples, of course, at the moment, but I feel like I've read, comics where there's generally, the sort of default style is a bit more on the realistic side, but, you might turn the page and there's a full page spread where you know, there's no background and we're just seeing, you know, focusing on the characters in white space. And so I guess maybe that's speaking a little bit more to this idea of less, you know, less detail, slowing you down. But I guess in that case, it's less about the detail one way or the other and more just about the variety of, you know, transitioning from what you've become accustomed to what you're then taken to.
Yeah, and I think also, I probably should have said this in the beginning, is that rules are meant to be broken. Like, I'm not saying anything that's going to be a hard and fast rule, because as soon as you say that this is the way it works, you can always find an example of how it works differently by somebody else. So, you know, like, you know, I can't think of anything right off the top of my head, but they're just like always different ways in which people work that can make it effective. So if you can make it effective doing it the opposite of what I just said, then that would actually work. But for me, what I found is that, and what I found when reading stuff is that when people slow pages down because they really want you to spend time looking on them, and then when they slow down, they spend more time drawing them. But there is an argument that can be made that the economy of a page, by taking and just putting one single image on that page, can slow down the pacing as well. So I think that's I think it can go both ways.
Yeah, I want to throw something on top of that, actually, just because we're talking about like what works for you and the way that, you know, rules sort of exist in comics, but also it's a bit of a free-for-all. And when it comes to expressing your style, like, you're defining the rules of your world as you make it, and then you're the person who can break them as well as you go. So there's not like a universal here, there's just what feels right for you, and noticing, like, I'm using these things to denote a certain state. I'm using these things for when I'm trying to make things happen fast, these things for when I want them to slow down. And that's like your language within whatever piece you're making.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point, because, you know, I always tell my students, you are the god of your artwork, right? So you only show people what they want, what you want them to see. Like, you set the rules, you set the ideas, you set everything. So you are the god of that work. So if, like, the symbols, the sign pictures that you are using mean that if you indicate something that doesn't have any information, or if you've sort of limited information in a certain way, is supposed to make people feel that way. It is your responsibility to make sure that that's clear to the audience as they go along. And vice versa. And so, like, I think that that's a really important thing to remember, is that you dictate the rules. Like, I don't make the rules. Like this is, like, I'm just telling you, like, I got a degree in, I got my MFA in painting. I teach comics now. I made all this shit up on the fly. Like, this is me coming up with ideas about, like, reading things and picking things from different places. And, like, this is what it seems like. This is how it seems like it makes sense to me. But, and you will, like, and some of you might go, that was really great. What Joel said was really awesome. And some of you will be like, that's just bullshit. I'm never going to listen to anything that he just said. But so, like, what I'm just saying, like, but you are the god of your artwork. So it's your responsibility as a creator, someone who's making comics, who's thinking about it, is to set up those rules so that people, I was talking, somebody mentioned Hillary Chute in the chat, and I was having a conversation with Hillary, because she teaches at a school across from me, and she was saying that, and this is just a conversation over coffee, she was like, comics have this tendency, like, you set up these rules in the beginning for people to follow, and then they follow you. You've set those rules up, and then they follow along the way. And that's typically how I do it. I set up these rules in the beginning so that this is the way you understand that this is what happens and this is what's going to happen. And so now it's my responsibility, so that if I show you that I am using my rules that to do what I want them to do. And if I change them, it'll be really apparent to you that I changed this for a specific reason. I know that sounds convoluted, so ask me to explain it again, and I might be able to make it a little bit better.
I actually was wondering if we could keep moving the subject and talk about, oh shoot, what's it called when there are, like, lines or other, like, emanata? Is that the right word?
Yep.
Yeah, like, I noticed you used emanata for the image of like Bully Gill. Like there seemed to be almost like a flame-like background, and the word balloons also seem to
Yeah,
be.
so with those images, I can pull those back up and show y'all. So there's a, actually, I'll show you this because this probably makes a little bit more sense. So early on in the book, there's a scene in which I say that kids were, they asked me, they're like, what do you want to be when you grow up? And I get this piece of paper, and I remember this so vividly, that the teacher's like, draw a picture of what you want to be when you grow up, because it's like busy work, right? Like this is what you do when you want to go like grade some papers or something. And so she gives us this paper and she goes, draw what you want to be when you grow up. And so I draw. So I'm sitting there and I look around to all these other kids and I think to myself, I'm going to draw a fireman, because that's what kids usually say, right? I want to be a fireman. I've seen it on television or whatever. So I drew a fireman, and then I drew that fireman. And then later I say, instead of becoming a fireman, because of all the anger that I had as a kid, I became the fire. And so fire becomes a constant sort of symbol that I use over and over and over again. And let me share this and I'll show you some other images from fights. Oops, I gotta stop sharing and share it again, because this is that situation where I shared the wrong screen.
I think you're at the end of the show. At the
Oh,
end
that's
of it, yeah.
that's
So you go to the
exactly
beginning.
what it is. I wasn't planning on showing this, so that's probably it. So this is the chapter opening from that scene to show that I became the fire. Further along, I'm going really fast. Sorry if it gets anybody like headaches. So this is this is me showing that flame. So I put that flame, so that flame becomes like a constant image. So that little tiny flame becomes a constant image. So it's like at that point, it's just sort of burning. But when you get further on, like this is a scene where I'm bullied and this kid says something about my dad, and that flame comes back, and I basically just become the fire. And so, when you're a fire, right? When you're a wildfire, when you're a fire like that as a kid, when you're like 8 or 9 and you're angry, you just burn everybody. Like it's just a thing. And so that becomes a common thing where I'm always on fire. Or when I show that flame, there's a place in the book where I have a friend who has some kids and she's abusing her kids, as opposed to going through this entire conversation about her abusing her kids. I just show that flame over the kids' heads so that people will know like they're going through the exact same thing. So this is also part of me sort of setting up how I want to tell the story and what the rules are, and then hopefully you following along as we go through that. So even the word balloons in certain places have flames around them as well. Emanata, for people who don't know what Emanata is the movement lines when you're using for comics. So like if you're moving, if you have like, swoosh, like the poof of somebody moving out of a panel, that would be an Emanata. So like when I pause for a second, I'm looking to see if people have questions. Stink lines, yes. Stink lines are Emanata. Spirals, yeah. Everybody said there's a lot of other stuff, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, emanata is like anything that emanates from a body, even an imaginary emanation of like the movement of energy or a sound, like, yeah. Or not even emanates from a body. Sorry, that was too human centric.
Joel, I have a question for you. And also open it up to at any of the artists here. But I'm curious, how much of your distinct rendering style, which gives so much emotion to your stories, how much of that did you get to through deliberate choice versus sort of it's naturally what comes out of you when you put your pencil on the paper?
That's a really good question. And because I deal with students all the time who are always like fretting over their style, it's something that I've actually thought about. I feel like we as humans, when we take in everything, right? We take in images, we take in pictures, we take in, like songs and music. We take in all of this stuff. And it creates our own personal aesthetic, and that stuff kind of comes out. And when drawing comics, I feel like there's this sort of shorthand that you develop, like a way in which you do a thing, right? Like this is a thing that you figured out that this is a way to draw a hand, and so this is the way you're going to draw that hand, and so that gets altered a little bit every time you draw it, but for the most part your hand is always going to be like this. And I'm not sure if it's a deliberate style choice, because when I look back at, because Fights was originally this magic realism sort of thing that I was going to do called Dandelions, which was a hot fucking mess. Like, I'm not going to even like try to hide it. It was just a dramatic mess. It was a hot garbage. It was a dumpster fire. It was like, how when you're taking the trash out and you get like a hole in the bag and you get garbage water on your foot? That's what Dandelions was. It was garbage water. And so, but you can still see some of that garbage water in Fights. You can still see a little bit of that, how it's kind of translate. You like, if you looked at both of them, you go, I can tell that you drew both of these, but this one is so much better than that was, because it's like you're always sort of altering things, like, and so I don't know how much style is just a choice between, it's an interesting, this is an interesting question, because I never know how much style is a choice of just being lazy. Like, this is the easiest way for me to get that information apart, or like, I'm going to sit down and draw something that's so fucking dope that's going to make everybody cry. And I don't think I've actually parsed out like what's the difference between those two things, because sometimes I'll draw something and I'm like, this is terrible, and I will redraw it, and it's only slightly better that my family's like, why did you redraw that? It doesn't even make any sense. And I'm like, but it feels better. Like, I don't even know how to explain that to you. This is like, the line weight is better. The, like that foot, that curve is slightly more curved, it's that sort of a thing. So, I don't know. It's kind of, I don't even know if I answered the question. I don't know. That's the best answer. That was a lot of talking for that. We're actually at time, right? 7:45.
Yeah, that's what we are. We can linger. We can
linger awkwardly, if you like. Talk more about just the process of comics, or if y'all have any more questions, it doesn't necessarily have to be about content and style. We can talk more about process, so you can ask more questions about Fights in general if you haven't read Fights. If you don't, there's still time.
Well, when you're working with such deeply personal material, how, like, some people will like plot things out in a very organized way and then go in and fill, and other people will like, just write and generate all the material and then condense. I'm kind of curious about like how you organize yourself to like tackle such a huge work.
So it's really funny. When I thought about originally coming up with Fights, I read a couple of things. I read Ta-Nehisi Coates' Between the World and Me. And talk about another different book, I read Raina Telgemeier's Smile. And so I guess like Fights is a combination of Smile and Between the World and Me. Because Raina, when she did Smile, it was like she told the story, like this sort of personal memoir through dental work, right? And for me, the commonality was violence. Like it was, like it was the first part of Fights is me explaining, asking my son, who has he ever been in a fight? And he said, and him saying no, and me going through that process of going, I've got to teach this kid how to fight. And so then it was more about like, what fights do I use, right? So I started thinking about all of the fights. And so I thought about the most memorable fights. And then as that became apparent that I was going to use fights as the story, it also became apparent that there was actually trauma that was happening at the time that those fights were happening. This one time, I remember my 5th grade year, when I first had to go live with family because my grandmother was sick. I fought the entire year, and when I look back on it, that's when I was suffering from sexual abuse and emotional abuse from family members. And so it was clear to me that was completely related to that one thing. And so it was about just building the narrative so that the fights would correspond with the things that were happening at the time. And so I actually just so lots of people write out scripts. I don't write scripts. And actually, just as a funny aside, when I'm doing the graphic novel adaptation for Stamped from the Beginning, A History of Racist Ideas, and when Ibram's agent said, can you write up a proposal of how you would do it? I'm like, no, but I can draw you some pages. That was how I think about it. I just drew 7 pages over a weekend to show them how I would do that. So that's what I typically do, is I draw thumbnails that basically tell the story. And then after I draw thumbnails, I actually start putting an outline together, sort of thinking about the narrative, how this is going to go from one thing to this thing, to this thing, to this thing. So I don't typically write more than about a paragraph at a time. I typically start drawing and then start writing and then start drawing. So it becomes this very collaborative way of thinking about it. And I'm sure you guys have seen, you can tell when a writer is drawing a comic that doesn't know how comics work, because it becomes word salad, right? It becomes walls of text, and which is just hard to read and not understand. And you can tell when illustrators who don't write draw comics, because it becomes every hand is so anatomically beautiful that you want to just cry when you see it, but you're not really reading a story. And so, and I guess that over the course of the time that I've been drawing comics, I've trained my brain to think in a very collaborative way about words and pictures and how they come together. If that makes sense.
I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit, because obviously these are really traumatic events. Did you have any way of processing, because worrying about re-traumatizing as you're creating them, was that a concern for you? And is there anything that you did to kind of mitigate the trauma and the re-traumatization of?
So the only times that I cried while making Fights, which is really interesting, is I cried when I was pitching it, because there was one company that I was pitching it that were just asking me the most ridiculous questions. They were basically asking me to take responsibility for Black people in general next to violence, and how did I feel about that? And I'm like, I'm not talking about all Black people. This is just my story. And they were like, where's the redemption in this story? And I remember saying to myself, I am the redemption. I am personally the redemption part of my story. And then there was another thing, is that as I was I'd draw and write and do thumbnails, and then I would read part of it. And it was just this slog of just sadness, right? And when you link back on it, it wasn't all sad. Not every moment of my childhood was terrible. And so I was trying to think about the things that weren't terrible in my childhood. And I came to this there's a point in the story where I'm having to catch the bus. It's when I was in 5th grade. I'm going to catch the bus at the church, which is next to my family's property. So I go up to the church, and there's another farm, the Edwardses, that's who they were. It was Mr. Edwards, Mr. Charles Edwards. He had a farm that was next to ours. And I would be there, and he would be working. It would be 7 o'clock in the morning. He'd already been up for 2 hours doing, milking cows and doing stuff. And Mr. Charles was like, you know, like our families had feuded, and I didn't know this as a kid, but our families had feuded over like some breezeway for parts of land. Anyway, Mr. Charles would like ask me to help him do stuff around his farm randomly, right? Like help him like stand on this side right here while I get these cows that go across the road. Like hold the door open while I pull the tractor in, like just random little things that he would do. And then there was this one point when I came up to visit him, I came up and he was feeding a calf that, I don't know, the mother was sick or something. And then after that, he would just leave the bottle out for me to feed the calf. And I remember how like amazing it was. Like as a kid, it was like this thing that I would look forward to. Like I would run up there to feed this calf. I was like 9, right? I would like run up there to feed this calf. And thinking back on that, I remember thinking to myself, he was such a nice man. Like he was just this really nice man. And then the realization that made me cry was that he wasn't necessarily a nice man. He was just a regular person. This is how regular people treat children. And that had happened so few and far between in my life that I thought that this was like an amazing thing, when in reality, it's just what people do, right? Like this is how I treat kids. Like I'm not super nice to kids. I'm just like, that's a kid. You should be nice to kids, right? That's what you do. It's not like I'm a saint. But I remember in my head thinking growing up that he was a saint. And so that was the other time that I sort of like just cried. And my wife was like, maybe you should go back to therapy. Like, it's fine. It's fine. I got it. It's fine. It's fine. But actually, there's a really interesting, there's a video, he died like 7 or 8 years ago. There's a video of him when Obama was running for president the first time. He's in Bristol, Virginia, which is right on the corner between Virginia and Tennessee. And Mr. Charles had made him a cane and like presents it to Obama on stage. They bring him on stage. He's like 87, 88 years old. They bring him on stage and and he gives Obama a cane. And that's the man that actually was Mr. Charles that gave me this, let me milk this cow. So like, yeah, but it's like the sort of like getting over this was all of the years of therapy before fights. I don't think I could have written Fights if I had not actually spent time thinking about it and going through it and dealing with it. Nobody ever accused me of not being able to talk.
Hey, Joel, I have a question.
Yes.
Like what was the process of realizing that you're going to tell this story? Like, at what point did you decide, like, hey, this is a thing I want to talk about and make into a memoir? Like what you were just saying, like, it took you years of therapy to get past it. Like, was it after that you realized, like, hey, this is a story worth telling? Or was it in your heart kind of for a while?
No,
or
I think it was like when I first, I mean, you saw the hot garbage water that was Dandelions, right? Do you remember it at all?
No.
I would bring it to the meeting. So like, yeah, like it was terrible.
But dude, you get some self-esteem, man. Your stuff is great.
No. It was terrible. I'm sure that's why you don't remember it, because it was that bad.
Listen to him, people.
I was originally, I think when I first started drawing comics, I wanted to tell my own story. Like it was kind of like at the end, it was like almost 15 years ago, at the end of like the therapy, I just got out of grad school and I was like teaching, and I'm like, this is now I'm going to tell my story. And so it was just like, I mean, everybody thinks they have a story to tell, right? And then I just like put it away and I started drawing Black history, because that was, the stories were already there and I could just like easily compartmentalize those and put them out there. And then it was, like I said, it was reading Ta-Nehisi Coates' Between the World and Me and Raina Telgemeier's Smile. And the thing about Ta-Nehisi Coates' Between the World and Me, if y'all haven't read it, like he's the same age I am. He's from Baltimore. I'm from Southwestern Virginia. They're pretty close. We have a lot of culture in common. But he had described me what it was like for me to grow up in a way that I hadn't thought about. Like in that book, he talks about like being Black in America is about always protecting your body and thinking about that and how that rules everything. And like, it was like a common thing for me to not go to a specific mall in my town, in the city that I grew up in, because I might have to fight. And if I did go to that mall, make sure I took enough people with me and make sure that we didn't go at specific times because they might be shooting during those times, or how many times people had pulled guns on me. So it was more like thinking about it in those terms, and like, people don't like, and I grew up in the mid 90s. Like, I was a teenager in like from 90 to 95. And so like, I was in the time when people would have looked at me and were like, super predator, right? Like, I carried a gun. There was a point in my time, when I was a teenager, where I carried a gun. And that was a thing when, like, looking back on that, because people always think people carry guns because they want to be badasses. But no, it was out of absolute fear. Like, I am going to get killed unless I have something to protect myself. And so when taking all of this stuff into consideration, and then thinking about how people look at kids and think of them as throwaway, it was just really important for me to say, this is a story about the stuff you don't see with kids, like the stuff you don't see with people who've been through these kind of things. And I wanted to tell that story. And so it was like it's a long process. At some point I'm going to go back to it and do something that's more fictional, related to my own life. Because there's a lot of stuff that I left out. Like, there was a whole period in my life where I was just like, I was going to be a rapper. That was just all I was going to do. And like, I performed at shows and I did clubs, and we had all these adventures with my friends. Like, we did all of this stuff. Like, and just recently, like in the last year, this girl that I dated had found a mixtape, and I found some of the songs, which I thought they were gone forever. And so I'm thinking about building a fictional story based on that, but I got shit to do before that. So. So how was the process different from the Black history? So Black history is different because it's much more easier to compartmentalize somebody else's trauma, and not feel it for yourself. So there were times in which I had to step away from fights to go, this has to be like, I have to step away from it just to draw the story. Whereas with, I'm doing a book about Robert Smalls right now, and it's much more easier for me to imagine, without being re-traumatized, what it was like for him. Do you know what I mean? Like I try to sit and think of myself, like what it must have felt like to do that, which is not good, right? Because things happened to him that were traumatic. But it's it's easier because I don't have to feel those emotions. Like, I don't have to go back to that time. So I can actually separate those things out a little bit better. And also, the stories are with people in history, their stories are already there's already like a beginning, a middle, and an end, and I don't really have to think very much about it. There are times when I just start drawing panels to just sort of make connections, like, oh, this thing happened, and start drawing it out to see what it looks like, just without even thinking too much about it. But with fights, I had to actually really plan out these things and think about them, because I didn't want to add too much or eliminate, any of the things that I think are capital T truths about my own life. I hope that answered the question. Now we're 15 minutes past, so
Shall we?
More questions? Does anyone have any more questions?
Well, here's a question. Who's up in 2 weeks?
That would be me. Yep, I believe it's July 14th is the date. I'm gonna double check that right now, but I'm pretty sure, because it was the only date I really needed to remember when we made this plan. Yep, Tuesday, July 14th. I'm gonna be talking about collaborating with accessibility needs. I think it's going to be collaborating across access needs. I need a catchy title for this. But yeah, this has been amazing listening to Joel, and I look forward to trying to meet this bar in 2 weeks' time.
Well, thank you guys for coming to hear me talk about hot garbage water for a while. Thank you for your questions. They were great. I think that's about it.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Joel. This has really been just remarkable. And I learned so much. It was really, really amazing.
Well, thank you guys.